The Life of Dwight L. Moody. Chapter 12. Young Men's Christian Association Conventions. During his leadership of the Chicago Association from 1865 to 1871, Mr. Moody's influence was felt not only in Chicago, but in the international and state conventions. He was president of the International Convention in Albany in 1868, Baltimore 1869, Indianapolis 1870. It was at the Indianapolis Convention that Mr. Moody first met Mr. Sankey, who was a delegate from his native town of Newcastle, Pennsylvania. The reputation of the Chicagoan had already aroused Mr. Sankey's interest, but as both were seated upon the floor of the hall among delegates, his curiosity could not be gratified during the first few days. At the close of the convention, it was announced that Mr. Moody would lead an early morning prayer meeting at 6 o'clock the next day in a neighboring church. This afforded the opportunity Mr. Sankey had looked for, and he came with a friend. There was some difficulty in starting the singing until Mr. Sankey's friend urged him to begin a hymn. He began to sing, "There is a fountain filled with blood," in which all the congregation joined. At the close of the service, Mr. Sankey was introduced by his friend and was immediately recognized by Moody as the leader of the singing. A few inquiries regarding Mr. Sankey's family ties and occupation followed. Then the evangelist announced in his determined fashion, "Well, you'll have to give that up. You are the man I have been looking for, and I want you to come to Chicago and help me in my work." Mr. Sankey was somewhat surprised at this sudden suggestion and assured Mr. Moody that he could not leave his business, but accepted an invitation to lunch with him that day and learned something of the nature of the work proposed. Nothing definite resulted from this conference, although Mr. Sankey promised to give the matter his prayerful consideration. Later in the day, a card was handed him asking him to meet Mr. Moody that evening at a certain street corner to assist in an open-air service. To this, Mr. Sankey responded by writing on the back of the card, "I'll be there." In company with a few friends, Mr. Sankey met Mr. Moody at the appointed place, and thus describes the informal service that followed. Without stopping, Mr. Moody walked into a store on the corner and asked permission to use a large empty box which he saw outside the door. Then he rolled to the side of the church and, taking his stand upon it, asked me to sing the hymn, "Am I a Soldier of the Cross?" After one or two hymns, Mr. Moody began his address. Many workingmen were just then on their way home from the mills, and in a short time a large crowd had gathered. The address that evening was one of the most powerful I had ever heard. The crowd stood spellbound at the burning words, and many a tear was brushed away from the eyes of the men as they looked up into the speaker's honest face. After talking about 15 or 20 minutes, he closed with a short prayer and announced that he was going to hold another meeting at the Academy of Music, inviting the crowd to follow him there. We sang the well-known hymn, "Shall We Gather at the River," as we marched down the street. It took but a few minutes to pack the lower floor of the Academy. Mr. Moody seeing to it that the laboring men were all seated before he ascended the platform to speak. The address was as impressive as the one delivered on the street corner, and it was not until the delegates began to arrive for the evening session of the convention that the meeting was brought to a close. Mr. Moody cut short his sermon, and after a word of prayer, dismissed the audience, telling them that they could now go home and get something to eat. Mr. Sankey was greatly impressed by these two meetings, and after the convention went back to Newcastle and told his family of his invitation to Chicago. Some months later, he yielded to Mr. Moody's invitation to come for at least a week, and then to decide the question. He arrived in the city early one morning, reaching Mr. Moody's home just as the family were gathering for morning prayers. He was at once asked to sit down at the organ and lead them in a hymn, which he did. They spent their first day together visiting the sick who were members of Mr. Moody's congregation. Mr. Sankey sang, and Mr. Moody read words of comfort from the Word of God and offered prayer for the healing of both body and soul. The following Sunday, a large meeting was held in Farewell Hall. At the close of the service, a number of persons arose for prayer, and at the close of the inquiry meeting, Mr. Moody turned to the singer and said, "You are going home tomorrow, but you see I was right in asking you to come and help me in this work, and I hope you will make up your mind to come as soon as possible." This wish was granted, for Mr. Sankey soon resigned his business, went to Chicago, and joined Mr. Moody in his work in the Illinois Street Church, and also in that of the Young Men's Christian Association. In 1879, at the International Convention of the Young Men's Christian Association held in Baltimore, Mr. Moody was enthusiastically elected president. At this time, he answered several important questions in his characteristic way. One of these was with reference to the work of the General Secretary, to which he replied, "A man cannot be an evangelist and General Secretary without spoiling his work in both positions. The Secretary, in order to succeed, must take up the work for young men and decide to do this one thing. On this account, I gave up the secretariatship to become an evangelist. You cannot do both." When asked if it were advisable to appoint unconverted men on committees, and if so, under what circumstances, he said, "Well, if you want to carry a corpse, then put them on. A man that is dead has to be carried. I think one man with Christ in his soul is worth 1,000 of those without Christ." When anyone went to him while he was secretary of Chicago and bored him with some hobby to be worked out in the association, he would say, if it was good in itself, "Yes, that is a good thing to do. I will appoint you chairman of a special committee to work that out. You fill up the committee with several others and go to work." His attitude on social problems was determined by experience with men. He had little sympathy with efforts towards amelioration, which stopped at giving food. At the same time, he had no patience with those who tried to stir up strife between the classes. When asked what he would do for the unemployed, or what advice he would give them, he said, "First of all, to seek the kingdom of God and his righteousness, believing his promise, which I never knew to fail, that all things will be added to them. Second, to pray to God for work. Third, to be patient as possible during these times of hardship. Fourth, to look earnestly for work. Fifth, to take any honest employment that offers itself. Sixth, to study economy. I think one of the greatest needs of our country is that the laboring men should own their own homes. We used to have men coming in all the time," he would say, "asking for work when I was secretary in Chicago. They would tell me of their sufferings and how they had no work and wanted help. At last I got a number of cords of firewood and put it in a vacant lot, and I got some saws and saw butts, but kept them out of sight. A man would come and ask for help. 'Why don't you work?' I would ask. 'I can't get any work.' 'Would you do anything if you could get any?' 'Oh, yes, anything.' 'Would you really work in the street?' 'Yes.' 'Would you saw wood?' 'Yes.' 'All right.' And then he would bring them out a saw and saw bucket and send them out. But he would have a boy watch to see that they did not steal the saw. Sometimes the fellow would say, 'I will go home and tell my wife I got some work,' and that would be the last we would see of him. During the whole winter, I never got more than 3 or 4 cords of wood sawed. He formed friendships in the association work which continued through life and were of great assistance to him in his evangelistic as well as his educational work. General J.J. Este of Brattleboro became acquainted with Mr. Moody in September 1867 at the Young Men's Christian Association Convention held in Burlington, Vermont. "I shall never forget his coming into the church where the convention was held," says General Este. "His entrance was as inspiring to everyone present, and from that time until the close of the meeting, the enthusiasm which prevailed was something remarkable. About 6 weeks later, I visited Chicago and called upon him. I had simply met him at the convention referred to, but he immediately knew me and called me by name. This I learned afterwards was one of the peculiar gifts with which he was endowed, that of putting names and faces together and rarely making a mistake. The following fall, I had the pleasure of entertaining him at my home during the Young Men's Christian Association Convention, which was held in Brattleboro. We had a number of guests, and when he came, he brought one of his brothers with him. I shall never forget one thing which occurred at that time. As we came out to the dining room after breakfast, he whispered to me to ask everyone to pray at family devotions, which I afterwards learned was his way of getting his brother to offer his first public prayer. The brother repeated the Lord's Prayer as part of the service. The summer following his return from his first trip to Europe, he was in Northfield holding meetings, and we used to go down with a carload of people to assist, and not only received a great blessing ourselves, but were able to help in the inquiry room. When the schools were started, he invited me to become one of the trustees, which position I have held ever since. Before the Mount Hermon School was begun, he took me over the ground in his buggy and invited me to become a trustee of that school, which position I very gladly accepted. And during its early days, while he was abroad, I visited the school nearly every week to straighten out such difficulties as might occur from time to time among the boys. There were then simply the 2 farmhouses with 12 boys, a teacher, a matron, and 1 servant in each house. Our relations had been very intimate ever since those days, and I consider it one of the greatest honors of my life to have been in any way associated with him and to have known him so intimately. I can truthfully assert that he was the most sincere man I ever knew. He was extremely cautious and has often said to me that I might be able to do such and such things, but that it would not answer at all for him in his position to do them. Of all the men I ever knew, I think he was the most careful about keeping himself from every appearance of evil.